The castle rises when humanity forgets God, not metaphorically, literally. Every 100 years, when faith weakens and darkness fills the hearts of men, stone and shadow tear themselves from the earth. Towers claw skyward, walls materialize from mist, and somewhere deep within those corridors, Count Dracula opens his eyes once more. This is not a tale of good defeating evil. This is the story of a curse that spans nearly 1,000 years, a bloodline sworn to fight, a castle that reshapes itself with each resurrection, and a vampire who cannot truly die because humanity refuses to let him stay dead. The year is 1094, the place, somewhere in the forests of Eastern Europe. A knight named Leon Belmont walks toward a fortress that does not yet belong to the monster the world will come to fear. He carries a whip blessed by the blood of a vampire. He does not know that this whip will become legend. He does not know that his descendants will carry it through centuries of war. He only knows that the woman he loves has been taken, and he will do whatever it takes to save her. Leon does not yet understand that this moment, this choice, this battle will echo through bloodlines and bind his family to darkness forever. The man he considers his closest friend, Mathias Cronqvist, lies waiting in the shadows of history. Mathias, brilliant tactician, grieving widower, has chosen a different path. He has chosen immortality. He has chosen to become something humans will hunt for all time. Before the name Dracula was whispered in terror, before Castlevania became synonymous with death itself, there was simply a man who lost too much and refused to accept it. A man who blamed God for taking his wife. A man who discovered that vampires do not age, do not sicken, do not lose the ones they love to time's cruel march. Mathias Cronqvist used Leon, used his bravery, his desperation, his love. And when Leon finally understood the depth of the betrayal, when he stood before his transformed friend holding the vampire killer for the first time, Mathias smiled and told him the truth. This was only the beginning. Leon could not kill him. Not yet. Mathias fled into darkness, into legend, into the waiting arms of centuries. But Leon made a vow that night, standing in the ruins of Walter Bernhard's castle, with Sara's essence still warm within the leather of his whip. He swore that the Belmont family would hunt this darkness, that every generation would stand ready, that no matter how many times Dracula rose, a Belmont would be there to send him back to the grave. Some vows are kept. Some vows become curses. The Belmont clan would learn that there is little difference between the two. The castle itself began as something else. Before it was Dracula's domain, before it became a creature of chaos that rebuilt itself with each resurrection, it belonged to another vampire, another nightmare. Walter Bernhard ruled from those towers once, but Dracula would make it his own. Over centuries the stones would remember him. The architecture would bend to his will. The very foundation would become an extension of his power, rising and falling with his life and death like breath in lungs that no longer needed air. And so the pattern was set. The curse was spoken. The bloodline was marked. From 1094 forward, the Belmont family would know no peace. They would be feared by the common people even as they fought to protect them. They would be ostracized, exiled, whispered about in the same breath as the monsters they hunted. Because to fight darkness for so long means carrying some of it with you. The Belmonts would learn this lesson again and again, in ways both tragic and terrible. The whip would pass from father to son, from generation to generation. Some would wield it with grace, others would struggle beneath its weight. A few would be corrupted by the very evil they sought to destroy. But the cycle would continue. Because Dracula would always return. The castle would always rise, and somewhere in the world a Belmont would hear the call, feel the weight of duty settle on their shoulders, and walk once more into that impossible architecture of stone and nightmare. This is the chronicle of that eternal war. The full timeline of the Belmont family's struggle against Count Dracula, the story of how a friendship became a feud, how a man became a monster, how a whip became holy, and how a castle became the physical manifestation of humanity's darkest impulses, rebuilt again and again from the negative emotions of mankind itself. From Leon's first heartbreak to Julius's final stand, from the 11th century to the dawn of the 21st, this is Castlevania. Not just a castle, not just a game, but a meditation on the cycles of violence, the weight of legacy, and the question that has haunted humanity since the first shadow fell across the first cave. Can evil ever truly be destroyed, or can it only be defeated again and again, forever until the end of time? The answer lies in the stones, in the whip, in the blood. Let us walk these halls together and see what the centuries have carved into their walls. The year 1094 marks the true beginning, though the seeds were planted earlier. Leon Belmont was not born to hunt vampires. He was born to serve his kingdom, to ride into battle for honour and glory, to live and die by the sword like countless knights before him. At 16, he had already proven himself. By his early 20s, he commanded respect from men twice his age. His company of knights was considered invincible, not because of Leon alone, but because of the brilliant mind that stood beside him, Mathias Cronqvist. If Leon was the sword, Mathias was the strategy. Where Leon inspired through bravery, Mathias achieved victory through intellect. They were friends in the way that only young men facing death together can be. Brothers in all but blood. They trusted each other completely, and that trust would become the foundation of everything that followed. Mathias married first. Elisabetha was her name, and by all accounts she was everything a man of Mathias's intelligence and ambition could hope for. Beautiful, yes, but more importantly, she matched his mind. She understood him. When she died, likely from illness, though the exact cause remains lost to history, something inside Mathias shattered in a way that could never be repaired. He took to his bed, not from physical ailment, but from grief so profound it consumed him. While Leon continued to fight for the kingdom, Mathias lay in darkness, studying, researching. The man who had always sought answers through reason and logic now turned those same tools toward the darkest corners of forbidden knowledge. He learned about vampires, about immortality, about a crimson stone that could grant dominion over death itself. This is where the historical record becomes clouded with legend. But based on what we know from the events that followed, certain things can be inferred. Mathias did not stumble into darkness. He walked toward it with his eyes open. He understood exactly what he was doing. His grief had curdled into rage, rage directed at God, at fate, at the unfairness of a world that could take someone so precious and leave him behind to suffer. Immortality was not his goal for its own sake. It was revenge. If God would not let him keep Elisabetha, then he would reject God entirely. He would become something that existed outside divine law. He would cheat death itself, and in doing so, prove that God's power had limits. This was not the reasoning of a madman. It was the cold logic of a brilliant mind pushed beyond its breaking point. But achieving immortality required resources. It required power. It required, specifically, the defeat of a powerful vampire and the harnessing of that vampire's essence through the crimson stone. Mathias could not do this alone. He was no warrior. So he used the only weapon he had left, Leon's love. Sara Trantoul, Leon's beloved, was not taken by random chance. Walter Bernhard, a vampire lord who ruled from his dark fortress, did not simply happen to choose her. Mathias arranged it. He manipulated events to ensure that Sara would be kidnapped, that Leon would have no choice but to pursue her, that Leon would be forced to enter Walter's domain, and there, in those ancient halls, Leon would become the instrument of Mathias's transformation. Leon renounced his knighthood. To enter the realm of darkness, he had to abandon his service to the kingdom. This was no small thing. His entire identity, his honour, his purpose, all of it built on his role as a knight. He gave it all up without hesitation, for Sara, for love. And he walked into Walter Bernhard's castle armed with nothing but a simple leather whip given to him by an old alchemist named Rinaldo Gandolfi. The battles Leon fought in that fortress would have broken lesser men. Walter's castle was a labyrinth of horrors, each room more nightmarish than the last. But Leon pressed forward, driven by desperation and love. When he finally found Sara, the truth began to reveal itself in pieces. She had been bitten. Vampirism's corruption was spreading through her veins. There was no cure, Rinaldo told him, no salvation for her physical form. But there was another way. Sara could become something greater than human. Her soul could be bound to Leon's whip, transforming it from simple leather into the vampire killer, a holy weapon capable of destroying the undead. The choice was impossible. Let her die slowly, painfully, or let her become part of something that could prevent others from suffering the same fate. Sara made the choice for him. She agreed. She gave her essence willingly, her love crystallizing into the first true weapon against darkness. Leon defeated Walter with a newly empowered vampire killer. He should have been victorious. He should have saved the day. But Mathias was waiting. With Walter's defeat, Mathias enacted the final stage of his plan. Using the Crimson Stone, he absorbed Walter's vampiric power. He transformed himself into something more than human, more than vampire. He became immortal. When Leon understood what had happened, when he realized that everything, Sara's death, his sacrifice, the entire nightmare had been orchestrated by his closest friend, his rage could have leveled mountains. But Mathias was already beyond his reach. The transformation was complete. Mathias had death itself as his servant, bound by the power of the Crimson Stone. Standing before the creature that had once been his brother in arms, Leon spoke the words that would echo through centuries. "This whip and my kinsman will destroy you some day. From this day on, the Belmont clan will hunt the night." Mathias did not seem particularly concerned. Perhaps he thought Leon's threat was empty. Perhaps he believed that no mortal bloodline could truly threaten him across the expanse of centuries. Or perhaps, on some level, he welcomed it. A part of him, the human part not yet fully dead, might have wanted someone to stop him, might have needed an adversary worthy of his immortal existence. Whatever the truth, Mathias Cronqvist faded into legend. It would be centuries before he emerged again as the being the world would know as Dracula. Whether he took that name immediately or adopted it later remains unclear, but the man Leon knew was gone, replaced by something that had chosen darkness and immortality over humanity and love. Leon returned to what remained of his life. He had no title, no Sara, no friend, but he had a holy whip and a purpose. He established the Belmont bloodline as a clan of vampire hunters. He trained, he taught, and he ensured that every generation would know the story, would understand the weight of the duty they carried. The vampire killer could only be wielded by those of Belmont blood. or by those deemed worthy through supernatural trial. This was both blessing and curse. The whip itself had power, yes, but it also demanded strength from its wielder. Those not strong enough would find their very life force drained by the weapon. The Belmonts would have to be warriors, yes, but also something more. They would have to be worthy of Sara's sacrifice, generation after generation. Leon Belmont died, as all mortals do, but his legacy did not. The whip passed to his descendants, the training continued. The family prepared for a threat that might not manifest in their lifetime, or their children's lifetime, but that would inevitably come. Because they knew the truth that most of humanity would forget. Mathias Cronqvist was still out there, still immortal, still waiting. The castle would not rise for centuries. Dracula would not take his full form until much later, but the pieces were in place. The board was set. The greatest game in history had begun, and neither player, neither the Belmont clan nor the immortal vampire could ever truly win. They could only play their roles again and again through the long dark centuries ahead. The whip has a name: Vampire Killer. Simple, direct, terrifying in its specificity. But names only tell surface truths. The real story of this weapon exists in the spaces between leather and sacred power, in the impossible binding of human love to divine purpose, in the blood of every Belmont who has gripped its handle. Before Sara's sacrifice, it was just a whip, leather and chain, weighted for combat but possessing no special properties beyond what any skilled craftsman could produce. Rinaldo Gandolfi, the alchemist who gave it to Leon, understood its potential but could not unlock it alone. The transformation required something he could not provide, something no spell or ritual could manufacture. It required willing sacrifice, pure love offered freely. When Sara chose to bind her essence to the whip, she did not simply die and transfer power. The process was more profound than that. Her soul, her very being, became woven into the weapon's structure on a metaphysical level. This was not enchantment in the traditional sense. This was transubstantiation. The whip became a holy relic in the truest sense, blessed not by church authority or religious ceremony, but by the most sacred force in existence, selfless love offered in the face of certain death. This is why the vampire killer can only be wielded properly by those of Belmont blood, or by those who meet extraordinary criteria of worthiness. The whip does not simply grant power, it demands strength, it tests the user. Leon's descendants would have to prove themselves worthy of Sara's sacrifice with each generation. Those who failed the trial, who lacked the spiritual or physical strength necessary, would find themselves drained rather than empowered. The whip would literally consume their life force. This created a unique pressure on the Belmont bloodline. They could not simply pass the whip to the eldest child and hope for the best. Each potential heir had to train relentlessly, had to cultivate not just physical prowess, but moral character. Strength without righteousness would not suffice. The vampire killer could sense the difference. Over the centuries, the whip's legend grew. Stories spread of its power against the undead, of how it could strike true even when its wielder's aim seemed off, of how it seemed to pulse with energy in the presence of vampiric evil. Some claim they could hear Sara's voice in the crack of the leather. Others said the whip grew warm to the touch when Dracula was near, as if Sara's sacrifice still burned against the darkness that had necessitated it. The weapon evolved too, or perhaps evolution is the wrong word. It adapted. The vampire killer's form remained consistent, leather and chain, but its power seemed to grow with each generation, as if the faith and courage of successive Belmonts added layers to its sacred nature. Some scholars of the occult who studied the Belmont legacy suggested that each successful hunt, each vampire destroyed, each time Dracula himself was sent back to the grave, the whip absorbed a fraction of that dark power and converted it to holy purpose. This would explain why the vampire killer seemed more potent in later centuries, why Richter Belmont could perform feats with it that would have been impossible for Leon. Not because Richter was necessarily stronger as an individual, though he was formidable, but because he inherited the accumulated power of centuries of vampire hunting crystallized in leather and Sara's eternal blessing. But the whip carried costs beyond the physical drain on unworthy wielders. The Belmonts who carried it into battle knew that they were walking with death itself. The vampire killer attracted darkness. Evil sensed its presence. Monsters that might have passed by harmlessly were drawn to it like moths to flame. This meant that Belmonts could never truly know peace, even in times when Dracula slumbered and the castle lay dormant. The whip ensured that its bearer would face constant trial. There were periods when the whip passed outside the direct Belmont line, when the bloodline thinned, when no suitable heir existed, when circumstances demanded it. The Morris family, descendants of the Belmonts through a more distant branch, wielded it during the early 20th century. John Morris carried the vampire killer during World War I, using it to stop a plot to resurrect Dracula through the bloodshed of that global conflict. But the whip always found its way back. Like Mjolnir returning to Thor's hand, the vampire killer seemed to possess a will of its own, a consciousness that guided it through history toward those who could best serve its ultimate purpose, the destruction of Dracula and the protection of humanity from the night's terrors. The weapon's significance extended beyond its physical power. The vampire killer served as a symbol of the Belmont legacy, a physical manifestation of duty passed down through blood and training. When a young Belmont first grasped the handle, when they felt its weight and its warmth, they were connecting not just to Sara's sacrifice, but to every ancestor who had carried it before them. Leon's determination, Trevor's courage, Simon's stubbornness, Christopher's heartbreak, Richter's passion, all of it lived in the leather. This psychological weight was, in many ways, heavier than the physical burden. Every Belmont knew that failure meant more than personal death. It meant betraying centuries of sacrifice. It meant dishonoring Sara's choice. It meant allowing Dracula another century of terror, condemning thousands or millions to suffer or die. The vampire killer was not just a whip. It was a covenant written in love and blood, renewed with each generation, carried forward through time by a family that had no choice but to accept the burden because someone had to, because Sara had given everything, because Leon had made a promise, and the Belmonts keep their promises no matter the cost. Nearly 4 centuries after Leon's vow, the name Mathias Cronqvist had been forgotten by most of the world, but the name that replaced it had not, Dracula, derived from the Romanian Dracul, meaning dragon or devil, depending on translation and context. By the mid-15th century, Count Dracula had emerged from legend into terrible reality, establishing himself as the most powerful vampire in existence. The year 1476 marks the first true confrontation between the Belmont bloodline and the fully realized form of their ancestral enemy. But the events leading to this battle reveal much about how fear and darkness can consume entire societies. Dracula had taken a second wife, Lisa, and here the tragedy deepens, because Lisa was not a creature of darkness. She was a physician, a healer, a woman who used medicine and knowledge to help the sick. In those times, such pursuits, especially in a woman, could easily be mistaken for witchcraft. The Church, in its zealous hunt for heresy, condemned Lisa. They burned her alive as a witch. Dracula, who had found something resembling redemption in her love, who had perhaps begun to remember what it meant to be human, watched the only light in his darkness be consumed by flames, and something inside him, whatever fragile thread still connected him to humanity, snapped completely. His declaration of war against mankind was not made in shadow or secret. He gave them 1 year to flee, to repent, to prepare. And when that year ended, he unleashed an army of demons and darkness upon Wallachia, the likes of which the world had never seen. Cities burned, families died. The night itself became weaponized against humanity. This should have been the moment for the Belmont clan to step forward. They had trained for centuries for exactly this scenario. But there was a problem. The Belmonts had been exiled from Wallachia. Irony cuts deep in the Castlevania saga. The very family that had prepared for generations to protect humanity from supernatural evil had been cast out because people feared their power, their knowledge of the dark arts necessary to fight darkness. The Belmonts walked among monsters so often that common folk began to see them as monsters themselves. When Dracula's war began, the Belmonts were forbidden from entering the region that needed them most. Trevor Belmont could have ignored this. He could have honoured the exile, let Wallachia burn as punishment for their rejection of his family. But that was never an option, not for a Belmont. Duty transcends petty human politics. Honour demands action, even when action brings no reward. So Trevor returned. The last surviving member of the Belmont clan walked back into Wallachia alone, carrying the vampire killer, knowing he was unwelcome even as he fought to save those who had exiled him. But he would not fight alone for long. In the ruins of a burning village, he encountered Cypher Belnades, a speaker magician, wielders of elemental magic and keepers of oral histories. Cypher had been turned to stone by a cyclops, preserved in that state until Trevor freed her. She could have fled. Should have fled, really, given the overwhelming nature of Dracula's forces. Instead, she chose to fight beside this exiled vampire hunter, offering her magic to complement his martial prowess. They were joined by Grant Dynasty, a pirate and thief whose entire crew had been slaughtered by Dracula's demons. Grant had been transformed into a monster himself, forced to serve as one of Dracula's guardians. Trevor freed him from that corruption, and Grant, grateful and vengeful in equal measure, added his agility and skill to their growing fellowship. The final member of their group defied all logic and expectation. Alucard, Dracula's own son, born of his union with Lisa. Adrian Fahrenheit, Tsepesh, who took the name Alucard, Dracula spelled backwards, in symbolic rejection of his father's crusade against humanity. Alucard was caught between two worlds, two natures, two impossible loyalties. His father was a monster destroying everything his mother had loved. His mother had died precisely because she was human, yet she had asked with her dying breath that Dracula not hate humanity for what they had done. Alucard honoured his mother's final wish by standing against his father. The Dhampir, half vampire and half human, brought supernatural power and intimate knowledge of Dracula's weaknesses to Trevor's crusade. This unlikely fellowship, the exiled vampire hunter, the speaker magician, the cursed pirate, and the vampire's son, they made their way through Wallachia's burning countryside toward the source of all the suffering. Castlevania had risen in full for the first time in recorded history. The castle that would become synonymous with Dracula's power manifested from darkness and stone. A fortress of nightmares anchored to the physical world but existing partially in some other dimension where horror had architecture and suffering had weight. The journey through the castle tested them in ways no training could prepare them for. Each corridor held new terrors. Zombies shambled through halls lit by impossible torches. Medusa heads floated past broken windows, their gaze turning flesh to stone. Skeletons reassembled themselves moments after being shattered, and everywhere, death itself watched through countless eyes. Death, the Grim Reaper. Not a metaphor, but a being, bound to Dracula through the power of the Crimson Stone, serving as the lord of vampires' most loyal servant. Death manifested as a hooded figure wielding a scythe, appearing and disappearing through walls, commanding lesser undead with a gesture. To reach Dracula, Trevor and his allies would have to face death itself. The battle against death is not well documented in surviving records, but based on what we can infer from later encounters, it would have required all four warriors fighting in perfect synchronization. Trevor's whip striking at the Reaper's physical form, Cypher's magic creating barriers of ice and fire to limit his movement, Grant's agility allowing him to dodge the scythe's swings while striking from unexpected angles, and Alucard's vampiric power matching Death's supernatural strength, blow for blow. They won, though how narrowly remains unknown. Death retreated, unwilling or unable to fully manifest without Dracula's direct command. The path to the castle keep opened before them. The throne room at Castlevania's highest point would become tragically familiar to future Belmonts. A long hall leading to a wide chamber, stained glass windows depicting scenes of suffering, and at the far end, stairs leading up to a platform where Dracula waited, his crimson eyes burning with rage and grief in equal measure. The battle between Trevor Belmont and Count Dracula set the template for all confrontations that would follow. Dracula did not simply attack, he transformed, revealing forms that should not exist in sane reality. His power seemed limitless, his endurance beyond mortal comprehension. But Trevor had the vampire killer, blessed by Sara's sacrifice and empowered by centuries of vampire hunting. Cypher's magic weakened Dracula's defences. Grant's blades found gaps in his guard, and Alucard, fighting his own father, struck with precision born of intimate knowledge. When Dracula finally fell, when his form began to dissolve into shadow and ash, his final words were not curses or threats. He spoke to Alucard, asking if this was truly what Lisa would have wanted. The question hung in the air unanswered as the vampire lord crumbled to nothing. The castle should have collapsed entirely. Later battles would see it vanish completely upon Dracula's defeat. But this first time, in 1476, the structure merely shook and groaned. Perhaps Dracula's power was too great to be fully dispelled by a single death. Perhaps the castle itself was already more than just stone and mortar. Whatever the reason, Castlevania endured, damaged but standing. Trevor and his companions escaped as chambers collapsed around them. Wallachia was saved. Humanity had been given a reprieve, but victory tasted of ash and sorrow. Too many had died, too much had been lost, and though Dracula was gone, none of them believed it was permanent. They were right to doubt. 3 years later, in 1479, the remnants of Dracula's court made their move. A devil forge master named Isaac, consumed by vengeance for his master's death, orchestrated a resurrection. The ritual was imperfect, incomplete, but it worked enough to bring Dracula back in weakened form. Trevor, now battle-worn and scarred from his previous encounter, responded to reports of undead activity. But he would not be the one to finish the fight this time. Injured during the approach to Dracula's manifested form, Trevor was forced to trust another. Hector, a second devil forge master who had turned against Dracula, would face the vampire lord in Trevor's place. Hector succeeded, sending Dracula back to whatever dark realm held him between resurrections. But this established a troubling precedent. Dracula could return even after being fully defeated. His resurrection did not require a full century to pass, not if his followers were determined enough, knowledgeable enough, and willing to pay the necessary price in blood and suffering. The Belmont clan would have to remain vigilant, always, forever. Because the war Leon had declared in 1094 was far from over. In fact, it was only beginning. Trevor married Cypher. Their union would strengthen the Belmont bloodline with magical talent, a gift that would manifest in future generations. They settled into something resembling peace, though both knew it could not last. Somewhere, in shadow and darkness, Dracula was gathering strength. The castle was waiting, and the 100-year cycle had begun in earnest. A century passed. The world changed. Wallachia recovered. New generations were born who had never known Dracula's terror firsthand, who thought of the vampire lord as distant legend rather than looming threat. This forgetting is precisely when darkness returns, when faith weakens, when humanity stops believing in evil. Evil finds it much easier to resurface. 1576. Christopher Belmont felt the call in his blood before any messenger arrived. The vampire killer grew warm in his hands. Dreams of burning villages and screaming voices plagued his sleep. He knew, as all Belmonts eventually knew, that his time had come. The duty passed down through generations of his family now rested solely on his shoulders. Dracula had risen again, exactly 100 years after Trevor's victory. The castle materialized from mist and malice, its towers reaching toward a sky that seemed to darken just from their presence. But this time, there would be no fellowship of heroes, no mage, no thief, no Dumpier son. Christopher would face the castle alone. The accounts of Christopher's journey through Castlevania are sparse. What we know suggests a brutal, grinding campaign. Where Trevor had allies to divide the castle's attention, Christopher had only his own strength and the vampire killer's power. Every trap, every monster, every cursed corridor demanded his full focus. Exhaustion became his constant companion. Pain was a given, but he pressed forward, because retreat was never an option for a Belmont. When he finally confronted Dracula, the battle was shorter than Trevor's had been, but no less intense. Christopher's style differed from his ancestors. Where Trevor had been tactical, Christopher was relentless. He gave Dracula no time to transform, no opportunity to demonstrate his full power. The whip cracked again and again, each strike carrying not just physical force, but the accumulated faith of 100 years of preparation. Dracula fell. The castle shook. Christopher escaped through collapsing passages, emerging into daylight bloodied but victorious. He had succeeded. He had fulfilled his duty. He believed it was over. He was wrong. Christopher's error was not in the battle itself, but in its conclusion. He had not destroyed Dracula completely. In his exhaustion, in his desperation to escape the collapsing castle, he had not ensured total annihilation. A fragment of Dracula's essence survived. Small, weak, but enough. For 15 years that fragment waited, gathered strength, watched, and when the time was right, when Christopher had lowered his guard and allowed himself to believe in peace, darkness struck at the thing he loved most, Soleil Belmont, Christopher's son. The next generation of vampire hunter, trained since childhood in the family arts, prepared to one day wield the vampire killer. On the night before the ceremony that would officially recognize him as a full vampire hunter and grant him the whip, Soleil vanished. Christopher's panic must have been absolute. Not just because his son was missing, but because he knew, with the certainty that comes from generations of hunting darkness, exactly what had taken him. The fragment of Dracula that had survived their battle had been patient, had waited for the perfect moment to strike, and had chosen the most painful revenge imaginable, not death, corruption. When Christopher found Soleil, his son no longer recognized him. Dracula's influence had transformed the young Belmont into something demonic. The boy who had trained his entire life to destroy vampires now served the vampire lord. The blood that should have made him anathema to Dracula had been twisted, perverted, used against its own purpose. Imagine Christopher's horror. To have your own son, your legacy, your future, turned into the very thing you had fought to destroy. To know that every blow you struck against this corrupted version of your child was necessary but devastating. To understand that mercy would doom the world but vengeance would destroy your soul. The castle had risen again in 1591. 15 years after Christopher thought he'd finished his duty, he was forced to return. But this time, the stakes were impossibly personal. Every corridor he fought through, he knew Soleil was somewhere ahead, waiting in darkness. Every monster he destroyed might have been commanded by his own son. The psychological toll must have been crushing. Dracula revealed himself holding Soleil like a trophy. The vampire lord's words, though not recorded precisely, would have been chosen for maximum cruelty, mocking Christopher's victory 15 years prior, demonstrating how easily a Belmont could be turned, suggesting that Christopher's failure to completely destroy him had doomed his own bloodline. But Dracula underestimated something fundamental about the Belmont legacy. It was not just trained into each generation. It was not just passed down through blood or technique. It was chosen. Every Belmont had to choose ultimately whether to accept the burden or reject it. Soleil, under Dracula's corruption, had had that choice taken from him. Christopher fought his way to his son. The battle between father and corrupted child is almost too painful to imagine. Every blow Christopher landed was an act of love, attempting to break through the demonic influence without destroying Soleil completely. Every strike Soleil landed in his corrupted state was a perversion of the training Christopher himself had provided. How long the battle lasted, we don't know. What finally broke through Dracula's hold, we can only speculate. Perhaps it was Christopher's refusal to give up. Perhaps some part of Soleil deep within the corruption recognized his father's determination. Perhaps the Belmont blood, even twisted, ultimately rejected the darkness forced upon it. Soleil broke free. The moment of his liberation must have been pure relief followed immediately by pure terror, because now they had to face Dracula together, father and son. The vampire lord who'd manipulated them both standing before them, laughing at their struggle. This time, Christopher did not make the same mistake. With Soleil fighting beside him, perhaps with a desperate fury born of having been used as a puppet, they attacked Dracula with everything they had. No mercy, no hesitation, no fragment could be allowed to survive. When Dracula fell, his body disintegrated completely. No essence escaped. No shadow fled into hiding. Christopher had learned his lesson. Whatever it took, however long the battle lasted, complete destruction was the only acceptable outcome. The castle collapsed around them. Father and son escaped together, but the damage to the Belmont reputation was catastrophic. Soleil had been turned, even briefly. The people saw this as the Belmont bloodline's weakness finally revealed. If darkness could corrupt a Belmont, then perhaps the Belmonts were not the bulwark against evil they claimed to be. The family's standing, which Trevor had worked so hard to build, which had earned them respect if not comfort, crumbled. Once again, the Belmonts found themselves feared and mistrusted. Soleil, though freed from corruption, bore the psychological scars for the rest of his life. The ceremony he'd been preparing for never took place. Some records suggest he never fully wielded the vampire killer, the trauma too great to overcome. Christopher Belmont succeeded in his duty twice, but victory tasted of ashes and loss. He had saved the world, but in doing so had sacrificed his son's future and his family's reputation. This is the hidden cost of the Belmont legacy, the price paid in ways that have nothing to do with physical injury. The whip would pass to the next generation. The cycle would continue. But Christopher and Soleil's story would serve as a warning, a reminder that Dracula's malice extended far beyond simple destruction. He sought to break the Belmonts not just in body but in spirit to corrupt the very legacy that opposed him. He had come terrifyingly close to succeeding. The name Simon Belmont resonates through gaming history with particular weight. If there is an iconic Belmont, a face most associated with the eternal fight against Dracula, it is Simon. His battles defined what the Castlevania series would become. His suffering revealed the true cost of victory against darkness. His determination set a standard that later generations would struggle to match. 100 years after Christopher's triumph and tragedy in 1691, Dracula rose once more. By now the cycle was well established. Every century, when the power of Christ weakened and darkness filled the hearts of men, the castle would tear itself from the earth and the vampire lord would open his eyes. This was not speculation or fear. This was pattern. This was certainty. And the Belmont clan prepared accordingly. Simon was different from his ancestors in key ways. Where Trevor had been a tactical fighter and Christopher a relentless warrior, Simon was methodical, precise. He had studied every recorded account of previous battles, analysed every mistake, memorised every lesson learned in blood. He approached vampire hunting like a craft to be mastered, not just a duty to be fulfilled. The people of Transylvania in 1691 had enjoyed a century of peace. Dracula had become legend again, a scary story told around fires, not an immediate threat. When the castle appeared on the horizon, when darkness began spreading across the land, many did not believe it at first. By the time they accepted reality, it was almost too late. Simon did not wait for permission or official sanction. The moment he felt the vampire killer pulse with warmth, the moment reports of undead sightings reached his ears, he was already moving. He took the whip, gathered the traditional sub-weapons blessed by the church, throwing axes, holy water, daggers, stopwatches that could freeze time itself, and walked alone toward Castlevania. The castle in 1691 had evolved. It was larger than in previous manifestations, more complex. This would become clearer in later resurrections, but the pattern was already emerging. Each time Dracula returned, the castle took a new form. Rooms rearranged themselves. Corridors led to impossible spaces. The architecture defied physical law. Alucard would later explain this phenomenon, describing the castle as a creature of chaos, a being that took a new shape with each rebirth. Simon's journey through these shifting halls became the template against which all other Belmont campaigns would be measured. 6 major regions of the castle, each with its own theme, its own challenges, its own nightmares. The main hall with its shambling zombies and swooping bats. The underground waterways where fishmen lurked beneath dark pools. The clock tower where mechanized death awaited. The library filled with forbidden knowledge and floating Medusa heads. The caverns deep beneath the foundations where primal darkness dwelt. and finally the keep, where Dracula waited on his throne. Each area demanded different tactics. The whip alone was not enough. Simon had to master the use of sub-weapons, understanding when to deploy Holy Water's flames, when to use the cross boomerang's range, when to simply rely on the vampire killer's leather and faith. The monsters he faced represented the full breadth of horror mythology. Not just vampires, though there were plenty of those, but mummies dragging themselves from forgotten tombs, Frankenstein's monster, animated by dark science, the Grim Reaper himself serving Dracula with scythe and malice. Each boss battle was a trial. Each victory came at the cost of injury, exhaustion, and resources. But Simon pressed forward, through bleeding wounds and broken bones, through the whispers of madness that the castle itself seemed to emit, through the psychological weight of walking halls that previous Belmonts had died in. He reached the throne room, faced Dracula, and in a battle that would become legendary, destroyed the vampire lord. Or so he thought. As Dracula's form disintegrated into ash and shadow, as the castle began its collapse, the vampire's final words were not a scream of defeat or a curse upon the Belmont name. They were something far worse. They were a promise. Dracula placed a curse upon Simon in those final moments, a slow corruption that would not kill immediately, but would torture for years. Simon escaped the collapsing castle. Transylvania celebrated. Peace returned. But Simon knew the truth. The curse was eating him from within. For 7 years, Simon suffered. The curse manifested differently as time passed. Physical decay, weakness, pain that grew worse with each passing month. Healers could do nothing. Priests could not lift it. The curse was tied to Dracula himself, and as long as any part of Dracula remained, the curse would endure. This led Simon to a terrible realization. Destroying Dracula's physical form was not enough. As long as any remnant of the vampire existed, resurrection was possible, and Dracula's body parts scattered across Transylvania, preserved through dark magic, remained. They were hidden, guarded, but they existed. If Simon wanted to truly defeat Dracula, to lift the curse and prevent future resurrections, he would have to do the unthinkable. He would have to gather Dracula's body parts and destroy them completely. Thus began Simon's quest in 1698, 7 years after his initial victory. This journey was different from the first. It was not a direct assault on a single fortress, but a scattered hunt across the entire region. Simon, weakened by the curse but driven by desperation, travelled from town to town, ruin to ruin, following legends and whispers about where Dracula's remains might be hidden. The body parts were not simply lying in forgotten corners. Each was guarded by powerful monsters, protected by traps, hidden behind puzzles that required not just strength but intelligence to solve. Dracula's rib, his heart, his eye, his nail. Each piece carried power of its own. Each radiated darkness that attracted lesser undead. Simon fought through zombie-infested graveyards to claim Dracula's rib from a hidden crypt. He descended into poisoned swamps where the water itself seemed alive with malice to retrieve the vampire's heart from a sunken temple. He climbed mountains where the air grew thin and cold to reach the monastery where Dracula's eye was kept, its gaze said to petrify any who looked upon it unprepared. Each piece he collected made him stronger, paradoxically. The curse remained, but by gathering Dracula's power, Simon was able to temporarily push back against its effects. Or perhaps the body parts themselves recognized the Belmont blood, responded to the same force that made the vampire killer so effective. The final confrontation was not in the castle, for Castlevania had not fully risen. Instead, Simon performed a dark ritual. using Dracula's own body parts to summon a shade of the vampire lord. Not fully resurrected, but present enough to be fought. This was necessary. The curse could only be lifted by defeating its source. The body parts could only be destroyed through Dracula's own dark power turned against itself. The battle between Simon and Dracula's shade was even more brutal than their first encounter. The shade was weaker in some ways, unable to access Dracula's full power, but it was also more desperate, more vicious, fighting for the very existence of all that remained of the vampire lord. When Simon finally shattered the shade and used its dissipating energy to completely destroy the body parts, something profound occurred. Not just the curse lifting, though that happened. Not just Simon's strength returning, though that too was welcome, but a fundamental shift in the eternal war. For the first time, Dracula had been truly defeated, not just sent back to whatever dark realm held him between resurrections, not just reduced to fragments, but destroyed utterly, with no physical remains left in the world. The cycle had been broken, or so it seemed. Of course, it was not truly broken. Dracula would return, though it would take longer than the standard century. The vampire's essence existed beyond the physical, tied to the darkness in humanity's hearts, to the crimson stone, to forces that transcended simple destruction of flesh and bone. But Simon's quest had bought humanity more time, had proven that the Belmont legacy meant more than just swinging a whip at monsters. It meant perseverance in the face of impossible odds. It meant sacrifice of health, reputation, and comfort for the sake of strangers who would never know the depth of what had been done for them. It meant choosing duty over peace, again and again, until duty and identity became one and the same. Simon Belmont survived his quest. He lived long enough to see the curse lifted, to train the next generation, to pass the vampire killer to his successor. But the 7 years of suffering had marked him. He was never quite whole again. The curse had taken something that could not be recovered. This is the Belmont legacy laid bare. They win. They survive. But they pay prices that mock the concept of victory. They carry scars that go deeper than flesh. And they do it anyway, because someone has to, and fate chose their bloodline centuries ago. Simon's story became legendary among vampire hunters, a tale of determination in the face of cursed suffering. His name would be invoked by future generations as the standard of what a Belmont should be. But those who told his story often forgot to mention the cost. They remembered the victory and forgot the 7 years of pain. The Belmonts never forgot. They couldn't afford to. 50 years after Simon's curse was lifted in 1748, the Belmont bloodline had evolved in unexpected ways. Trevor's marriage to Cypher Belnades, the speaker-magician, had introduced magical talent into the family's genetic legacy. This gift had been dormant in some generations, weak in others. In Juste Belmont it bloomed fully. Juste could wield both the vampire killer and cast powerful summoning spells. He was unique among Belmonts, a bridge between the martial tradition of vampire hunting and the mystical arts usually practiced by families like the Belnades. This made him formidable. It also made him complicated in ways previous Belmonts had not been. Magic requires understanding. It demands study, practice, and a certain openness to forces that most warriors prefer to simply hit with whips. Juste had to balance these aspects of himself, warrior and mage, skeptic and believer, all while maintaining the discipline necessary to wield his family's sacred weapon. But Juste's greatest challenge would not come from monsters or dark magic. It would come from friendship. Maxim Kishina was Juste's best friend since childhood. They had trained together, grown together, shared dreams of adventure and glory. But where Juste had inherited the Belmont legacy, Maxim had inherited only his own determination. No sacred whip for him, no magical talent. Just skill, courage, and a growing sense that he lived in Juste's shadow. Envy is insidious. It doesn't announce itself. It grows slowly, fed by small moments of comparison, by praise given to someone else, by the quiet knowledge that no matter how hard you work, you will never quite measure up. Maxim loved Juste as a brother. He also resented him as a rival. This psychological complexity made Maxim vulnerable when Dracula's servants began manipulating events in 1748. The castle had not fully risen. Dracula himself was not yet resurrected. But his followers worked in shadow, gathering his remains, preparing the ritual, seeking a vessel worthy of containing even a fraction of the Dark Lord's power. Maxim, in his desperate desire to prove himself equal to Juste, to show that he too could be a hero, set out to collect Dracula's body parts. He believed that by doing what Simon had done, by gathering and destroying these dark remnants, he could earn the respect and recognition he craved. He thought he was strong enough to resist their corruption. He was wrong. Dracula's essence, even fragmented, carries tremendous malice. Each body part whispered to Maxim, promised him power, suggested that perhaps he should not destroy them but use them. Why should the Belmonts have all the glory? Why should Juste be the only one remembered in legends? The corruption was subtle at first, a thought here, a justification there. Maxim told himself he was in control, that he was simply learning about his enemy to better destroy it. But dark magic does not need permission to influence. It needs only proximity and time. When Juste discovered what Maxim was doing, he felt betrayal and fear in equal measure. His best friend was playing with forces that had cursed Simon, that had corrupted Soleil, that had destroyed countless lives throughout history. But confronting Maxim directly might push him further into darkness. Ignoring the situation would ensure catastrophe. Juste chose intervention. He tracked Maxim to a manifestation of Castlevania, not the full castle, but a shadow version, birthed from the collected body parts and Maxim's corrupted desire. This castle within a castle, this fractured reflection of Dracula's fortress, represented the psychological and mystical battle taking place within Maxim's soul. The architecture was dissonant. Rooms overlapped impossibly. Corridors led to themselves. Two versions of the same castle existed simultaneously, and Juste had to navigate both, searching for Lydie, the woman both he and Maxim loved, who'd been taken as leverage by the dark forces, corrupting his friend. This is where Juste's magical talent became essential. His ability to summon familiars and cast spells allowed him to interact with the castle's supernatural nature in ways previous Belmonts could not. He could manipulate the overlapping realities, phase between the dual castles, reach areas that should have been impossible to access. But skill meant nothing compared to the emotional weight of fighting his way toward a confrontation with Maxim. Every monster Juste destroyed, he wondered if Maxim had commanded it. Every trap he avoided, he questioned if his friend had set it. The castle became a manifestation of their fractured relationship, beautiful in some areas where friendship still existed, corrupted and diseased in others where envy had taken root. When Juste finally found Maxim, the corruption was advanced but not complete. His friend wavered between lucidity and madness, between genuine concern for Lydie and the dark whispers of Dracula's remains urging him to complete the resurrection. The battle that followed was heartbreaking. Juste did not want to hurt Maxim, but Maxim, under the influence of Dracula's fragmented essence, attacked with real intent to kill. The vampire killer cracked against Maxim's blade. Spells flew, the castle shook around them. In the end, Juste's victory came not through superior strength, but through refusing to give up on his friend. Where a lesser man might have simply killed Maxim and ended the threat, Juste fought to save him, to drive out the corruption without destroying the man beneath. The exact mechanics of how this was achieved remain unclear. Some accounts suggest Juste used his magical abilities to draw out the dark influence. Others claim the vampire killer itself, blessed by Sara's loving sacrifice, could distinguish between Maxim's true self and the parasitic evil controlling him. Perhaps it was simply that Juste's determination to save his friend proved stronger than Dracula's desire to corrupt. Maxim was freed. Lydie was saved. The castle, both versions of it, crumbled into nothing as Dracula's remains were finally destroyed completely. All the outcomes that matter registered as victories, but the psychological aftermath was devastating. Maxim had to live with what he had done, with how close he had come to becoming the very evil he had sought to fight. Juste had to reconcile his friend's betrayal with his friend's redemption. Their relationship would never be quite the same. Trust, once broken, is difficult to fully restore. This period of Belmont history teaches a lesson often overlooked in tales of vampire hunting. The greatest threat is not always the monster with fangs. Sometimes it is the darkness within those we love. Sometimes evil wins not through direct assault but through corrupting good intentions. And sometimes victory requires not destroying an enemy, but saving them from themselves, no matter how painful that salvation might be. Juste Belmont succeeded in his duty. He prevented Dracula's resurrection. He protected those who needed protection. But he did so at the cost of innocence, his own and Maxim's, the simple belief that good people with noble intentions cannot be corrupted. The Belmont family learned, again, that nothing about their duty is simple or clean, that darkness reaches everywhere, that vigilance must extend even to those closest to you, that friendship itself can become a weapon in the hands of evil. If there is a Belmont who represents the absolute peak of vampire hunting prowess, it is Richter. Born in 1773, coming of age in an era when the Belmont legacy was well established and respected, Richter possessed everything his ancestors had cultivated over centuries: strength, speed, mastery of the vampire killer, magical ability inherited through Cypher's bloodline, and most critically, a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Richter knew he was exceptional. How could he not? From childhood, his abilities surpassed those of his teachers. He could perform feats with the whip that left veterans gasping. His command of sub-weapons was instinctive. Where previous Belmonts had to choose carefully when to deploy holy water or throwing axes conserving resources, Richter seemed to have limitless access, as if the very act of fighting darkness replenished his arsenal. This is not to say Richter was arrogant in a negative sense. He simply understood his own capabilities and moved through the world with the assurance of someone who had never truly been tested. That would change in 1792. Dracula's resurrection in that year followed a familiar pattern but with a twist. A dark priest named Juste, devoted to the vampire lord's memory, orchestrated the ritual. Juste had been studying the Belmont legacy, understanding that previous defeats had come because Dracula faced the vampire hunters on their terms. This time, things would be different. Juste kidnapped Annette, Richter's beloved, along with several other women from Richter's village. The goal was multi-layered. First, to use their life force in the resurrection ritual. Second, to bait Richter into coming to Castlevania while emotionally compromised. third, to demonstrate that even the greatest Belmont could be manipulated through love. Richter responded exactly as Shaft anticipated. He stormed toward the castle, fury driving him forward, vampire killer in hand. But unlike previous Belmonts who walked this path alone or with carefully chosen allies, Richter's campaign would gain an unexpected companion. Maria. Renard, a 12-year-old girl who happened to be a distant relative of the Belmont clan, possessed her own magical abilities. When Richter freed her from captivity, she insisted on fighting alongside him. The dynamic was unusual. Maria's youth should have made her a liability, someone for Richter to protect. Instead, her magic complemented his martial prowess perfectly. She could summon animal spirits to attack from angles the whip couldn't reach. Her agility allowed her to navigate the castle's impossible architecture in ways even Richter couldn't match. Together, they tore through Castlevania's defences. Richter's power in this era was staggering. He could perform techniques that previous Belmonts had only dreamed of. The item crash, unleashing all of his stored sub-weapons in devastating attacks. The hydrostorm, summoning divine pillars of holy water, backflips and slides that turned combat into acrobatic performance. Shaft threw everything at them, the traditional boss monsters, Medusa, Mummy, Frankenstein's creature. Then Death himself, the Grim Reaper wielding his scythe with centuries of experience. Nothing stopped Richter. He moved through the castle like a force of nature, unstoppable and inevitable. When he reached the throne room, when he faced Dracula directly, the battle was almost anticlimactic. Richter was too strong, too fast, too skilled. Dracula's transformations meant nothing. His dark magic found no purchase. In a fight that would have killed or severely wounded previous Belmonts, Richter emerged barely scratched. Dracula fell. Shaft's plan had failed. Annette was rescued. Maria was safe. Castlevania began to collapse. Richter had achieved complete victory, or so it seemed. 5 years passed. Richter settled into something resembling normal life, as normal as any Belmont's life could be. He had proven himself the greatest vampire hunter in history. He had surpassed even Simon's legendary prowess. The Belmont legacy had reached its apex in him. Then, in 1797, Castlevania rose again. This should have been impossible. Dracula had been destroyed. The 100-year cycle should not have allowed another resurrection so quickly, but the castle manifested anyway, dark and threatening on the horizon, and Richter Belmont vanished. Maria, now a young woman of 17, began searching for him. Her investigation led her to the castle, where she encountered Alucard, Dracula's half-vampire son, who'd been sleeping for centuries since his battle alongside Trevor. The castle's premature return had awakened him, and he felt compelled to investigate. What they discovered inside Castlevania shook the foundations of everything the Belmont legacy represented. Richter was there, but he was not a prisoner. He was not being tortured or held against his will. He had claimed the castle as his own. He sat on a throne in one of its halls, commanding its monsters, declaring himself the new Lord of Darkness. When confronted, Richter's words suggested madness or corruption. "It is I who have summoned this castle, and I who will resurrect Count Dracula. I will destroy all humanity and become the Dark Lord of this world." The implication was horrifying. The greatest Belmont, the strongest vampire hunter in history, had been corrupted by the very darkness he had dedicated his life to fighting. It seemed like the ultimate victory for evil, proof that even the best humanity had to offer could be turned. But Alucard sensed something wrong. His vampiric nature allowed him to perceive magical influences that humans might miss. He investigated carefully, fighting his way through a castle that had evolved yet again, its architecture expanding to include an inverted version of itself, a mirror image hanging upside down from the original, accessible only through specific portals. This inverted castle was Shaft's true domain. The Dark Priest had survived his apparent death 5 years earlier, had spent that time perfecting dark magic, had learned from previous failures. He could not corrupt Richter directly. The Belmont blood and the vampire killer's blessing protected against such overt manipulation. But indirect influence, subtle and patient, that could work. Shaft had placed a dark spell on Richter, not controlling his mind directly, but amplifying certain aspects of his personality. His confidence became arrogance. His pride became megalomaniacal desire for power. The traits that made Richter great were twisted into tools of corruption. He genuinely believed he should rule, that his strength gave him the right, that becoming the Dark Lord was simply accepting his true destiny. Alucard, with Maria's help, navigated both versions of the castle. They fought through demons and undead, through manifestations of darkness that should not exist. Alucard faced his own internal struggles, confronting the nature of his existence as a creature of both light and shadow. The castle seemed to test him specifically, questioning whether Dracula's son could truly stand against his father's legacy. Eventually they reached Shaft in his sanctum within the inverted castle. The Dark Priest's power had grown immense, fed by the dark energies of 2 castles, existing simultaneously. But Alucard had inherited much from his father, vampire strength and speed, combined with his mother's compassion and his own determination to honour her memory. Shaft fell. With the Dark Priest's death, his spell over Richter shattered. The greatest Belmont awoke as if from a nightmare, horrified by what he had done, by what he had almost accomplished. The corruption had been external, yes, but it had used his own pride as its foundation. That knowledge would haunt him. With Richter freed, Alucard could complete his true purpose. He ascended to the throne room, to the final confrontation with Dracula. His father, resurrected again through dark rituals and human malice, waited with the weariness of someone who has died and returned too many times. The battle between father and son carried weight beyond simple combat. Alucard pleaded with Dracula to remember Lisa, to honour her final wish that he not hate humanity. Dracula, in rare moments between attacks, showed flickers of the man he once was, the scholar Mathias who had loved and lost. When Dracula fell, his final words to Alucard revealed a truth both tragic and timeless. The blood is the life, and it shall be mine. Even in defeat, even facing his own son, Dracula could not escape what he had become. The dual castles collapsed. Alucard, feeling the weight of his cursed bloodline, chose to seal himself away, to sleep until darkness called him forth again. Richter, freed but scarred, stepped back from active vampire hunting. He had proven himself the strongest Belmont, yes, but also the most vulnerable to pride's corruption. The lesson was clear. Strength alone is not enough. Skill means nothing without wisdom. Even the greatest warrior can fall, not through weakness, but through their own unchecked strengths turned against them. The Belmont legacy continued, but it would be generations before another of the bloodline would wield the vampire killer. The whip passed to other families, to those deemed worthy though not carrying Belmont blood directly. The name would fade from prominence for a time, but the duty remained. Dracula would return, the castle would rise, and someone would have to stand in its halls and fight, whether they bore the Belmont name or not. To understand Castlevania is to understand that it is not simply a building. It is not stone and mortar, not architecture in any conventional sense. The castle is alive, not metaphorically, not poetically, genuinely, impossibly alive, a being composed of darkness given physical form, sustained by human malice and Dracula's will. Alucard explained this most clearly during the events of 1797. This castle is a creature of chaos. It takes a new form with each rebirth. This statement, delivered almost casually, contains profound implications. Each time Dracula resurrects, each time the castle rises from wherever it waits between manifestations, it restructures itself entirely. Corridors that existed in one century vanish in the next. Towers appear where none stood before. The underground depths expand or contract. Even the castle's location shifts, appearing by lakes, on mountains, near oceans, as if geography itself bends to accommodate it. This chaos serves multiple purposes. Practically, it prevents enemies from using knowledge of previous layouts against Dracula. A Belmont who had carefully mapped the castle in one confrontation would find that map utterly useless a century later. Every approach had to be treated as virgin territory, unexplored and dangerous. Psychologically, the shifting architecture creates disorientation. Humans rely on spatial consistency. We navigate by landmark and memory. When the environment refuses to follow natural law, when stairs lead to themselves, when doors open into rooms that should not exist behind them, the mind begins to fracture. The castle weaponizes wrongness, using architectural impossibility as a tool of psychological warfare. But beyond strategy, the castle's changing form reveals its true nature. It is not a place Dracula goes to. It is an extension of Dracula himself, a manifestation of his power made concrete. When he is weak, the castle is smaller, simpler. When his power is at its apex, the structure expands to incomprehensible size, birthing new wings, new depths, new impossibilities. The castle has consistent elements despite its chaotic transformation. Certain rooms appear again and again, taking different forms but serving similar functions. The main hall, where intruders first enter, always features pillars and shambling undead. The library always houses forbidden knowledge, and Medusa heads whose gaze turns flesh to stone. The chapel, twisted mockery of a holy ground, always exists somewhere within the structure. The clock tower, with its grinding gears and mechanical death, appears in most manifestations. These recurring spaces suggest that the castle has memory, that it carries imprints from previous incarnations even as it reshapes itself. Or perhaps they represent fundamental archetypes of horror that the castle must include, like certain ingredients in a dark recipe. The throne room never changes location. It sits at the highest point always, whether the rest of the castle shifts or not. This is Dracula's heart, the centre of his power, and it remains constant while everything else fluctuates around it. To reach it means climbing through whatever nightmare the castle has configured this time, but the destination is always the same. A long hall, stained glass windows, and Dracula waiting at the far end. The castle's relationship with physics borders on contemptuous. Entire sections float in midair with no visible support. Waterfalls flow upward. Gravity shifts in certain rooms, allowing enemies to walk on ceilings while hunters struggle to maintain footing. Distances stretch or compress, rooms appearing larger on the inside than exterior dimensions would allow. In 1797, this impossibility reached its apex with the inverted castle. An entire mirror image of Castlevania hung upside down above the original, accessible through specific portals, each room a dark reflection of its counterpart. Reaching it required finding pathways that should not exist, stepping through dimensional barriers into an architecture that defied even the already defiant nature of the primary structure. This inverted castle represented more than just spectacle. It suggested that Castlevania exists partially outside normal space, that the physical manifestation we see is only a fragment of something larger and more terrible. Like an iceberg, most of the castle's true form exists in dimensions we cannot perceive, and what Belmonts fight through is merely the tip-breaking surface into our reality. The materials from which the castle builds itself remain mysterious. Some sections appear to be normal stone, granite and marble carved with skill that should not exist in a fortress of evil. Other areas seem composed of shadows made solid, darkness that has weight and texture. Still others pulse with organic qualities, walls that breathe, floors that bleed when struck, ceilings that pulse like exposed veins. This suggests the castle draws materials from multiple sources. Perhaps it uses local stone and resources when manifesting, corrupting them through dark magic. Perhaps it creates matter from negative emotions, literally building itself from human suffering and fear. Or perhaps it pulls materials from the dark realm where it rests between resurrections, bringing pieces of that other world into ours. Whatever the truth, the result is architecture that should collapse under its own impossibility, but stands firm through dark will alone. Engineers examining Castlevania's structure, if any dared, would find it violates every principle of construction. The castle stands because Dracula wills it to stand. It stands because chaos has learned to build. The castle attracts monsters even when Dracula does not explicitly summon them. Undead creatures, demons, beings from nightmare all gravitate toward Castlevania as if drawn by magnetism. Some come to serve the Dark Lord. Others simply congregate in the one place where their existence is not merely tolerated but celebrated. This creates an ecosystem of darkness within the castle's walls. Different monster species occupy different regions, competing for territory and resources. Zombies shamble through the main halls because they require space to wander mindlessly. Medusa heads float in open areas where their flight is unimpeded. More intelligent creatures like death itself claim entire wings as personal domains. The result is a fortress that hardly needs Dracula's direct oversight to be deadly. The castle manages itself, its monster population maintaining order through natural hierarchy and territorial instinct. A Belmont entering Castlevania faces not just Dracula, but an entire ecosystem evolved to destroy intruders. When Dracula is defeated, the castle's collapse is immediate and total. Whatever force holds the impossible architecture together dissipates the moment the vampire lord's life ends. Towers crumble, foundations crack. The entire structure tears itself apart in minutes, as if eager to return to wherever it waits between resurrections. Those inside during the collapse have moments to escape, no more. The castle does not fall gracefully or slowly. It implodes with violence, as if angry at its own defeat. Belmonts have emerged from these collapses battered and bleeding, racing through disintegrating corridors as ceiling and walls pursued them like living things, and then silence. Where the castle stood, only ruins remain. Sometimes not even that. Sometimes the castle vanishes so completely it leaves no trace, as if it was never there at all. But it will return, when humanity forgets God, when darkness fills hearts with malice and despair, when 100 years have passed, or circumstances align to allow earlier resurrection. The stones will remember, the shadows will coalesce, and Castlevania will rise once more, a creature of chaos taking a new form to house the same eternal evil. Why a century? Of all the intervals darkness could have chosen for its periodic return, why does Dracula resurrect approximately every 100 years? The answer lies in a combination of supernatural mechanics, Christian mysticism, and humanity's own cyclical relationship with faith and fear. The traditional explanation, stated in various games and lore, centers on the weakening of Christ's power. Every 100 years, when the anniversary of Easter passes, when the resurrection of Jesus fades from immediate memory and becomes historical abstraction, the spiritual protection he offered against darkness diminishes. This creates a window, not a certainty of Dracula's return, but an opportunity, a time when the barriers between death and undeath grow thin enough to cross. But the cycle is not perfectly regular. Dracula has returned in less than a century, as in Trevor's second battle just 3 years after the first. He has also remained dormant longer than expected when circumstances prevent resurrection. The 100-year pattern is a tendency, not an absolute law. The mechanism of resurrection varies. Sometimes Dracula returns through his own dark power, his essence reforming when conditions are right. Other times, his followers perform rituals using sacrifices, body parts, and forbidden magic to pull him back from death's realm. Occasionally, as in 1797 with Shaft, a single devoted servant can orchestrate resurrection through sheer determination and arcane knowledge. This variability makes stopping Dracula's return more difficult. If the resurrection were always automatic, always following the same pattern, countermeasures could be prepared. But because each return happens differently, the Belmonts and other vampire hunters must remain constantly vigilant, ready to respond to threats from multiple directions. The resurrection process itself appears to be painful and incomplete initially. Dracula does not return at full power. He requires time to gather strength, to remember himself, to fully manifest his abilities. This grace period, sometimes hours, sometimes days, gives vampire hunters a window to strike while he is vulnerable. However, reaching Dracula during this vulnerable phase means entering Castlevania as it rises, navigating a structure still forming, still deciding what architecture to adopt. The castle in these early moments is even more chaotic than usual, corridors incomplete, rooms overlapping, the creature of chaos not yet fully awakened. The Crimson Stone plays a crucial role in the cycle. This dark artifact used by Mathias Cronqvist to first transform into a vampire serves as an anchor for Dracula's essence. As long as the Crimson Stone exists, complete destruction of Dracula is impossible. His consciousness, his power, his very being are tied to the stone's existence. This creates a paradox for vampire hunters. Destroying Dracula's physical form is difficult but achievable. Finding and destroying the Crimson Stone is another matter entirely. Its location changes. It may be hidden within Dracula himself, within the castle's foundation, or secreted somewhere in the world entirely separate from the vampire lord's manifestation. Some scholars of the dark arts have theorized that the Crimson Stone exists partially outside normal reality, that attacking it directly is impossible because it only fully manifests when Dracula is at peak power, which is precisely when reaching it is most difficult. This creates a catch-22 that ensures Dracula's eventual return regardless of how thoroughly he is defeated. The cycle also depends on humanity itself. Dracula's resurrection requires negative human emotions. Despair, hatred, fear. These are not just consequences of his return but prerequisites for it. When humanity falls into widespread darkness, when wars rage and faith falters, these collective emotions create the spiritual environment necessary for Dracula to cross back from death. This means humanity itself ensures Dracula's return. The very evil in human hearts, The darkness that Dracula exploits and encourages is what allows him to resurrect. It is a cruel irony. The worse humanity behaves, the more certainly their punishment returns. Between resurrections, Dracula exists in some form of conscious limbo. He is not truly alive, but not entirely gone. Records of communication with his spirit during dormant periods suggest he remains aware, planning, learning from previous defeats, preparing for his next manifestation. Death, his loyal servant, may maintain continuity between resurrections, serving as memory and advisor when Dracula returns. The 100-year cycle has shaped both human and supernatural society. Certain families have oriented their entire existence around it. The Belmonts, obviously, but also the Belnade speakers who maintain oral histories. The Church has created orders dedicated to tracking dark magical activity, watching for signs of Dracula's stirring. Even common folk in Transylvania have developed cultural practices around the cycle. Rituals performed every century on the anniversary of previous defeats. This creates a strange rhythm to history in the Castlevania world. Generations pass in relative peace. People forget. They dismiss the stories of their grandparents as superstition. Then darkness returns, reminding them that some legends are true, some nightmares walk in stone corridors, some evils cannot be permanently destroyed. The psychological weight on the Belmont family must be immense. Every child born into the bloodline knows that sometime in their life, or their children's or grandchildren's lives, Dracula will return. They cannot know exactly when. They cannot prevent it. They can only prepare and pray they are ready when the call comes. This creates a culture of constant readiness tinged with fatalistic acceptance. The Belmonts train not for a battle they hope to avoid, but for one they know is inevitable. They pass down knowledge, techniques, warnings, creating an oral and practical tradition that spans centuries, all oriented around a single purpose: be ready when darkness returns. The 100-year cycle is both curse and blessing. A curse because it guarantees suffering will repeat, that each generation will face the same nightmare as their ancestors. A blessing because it provides time between battles, allows healing and preparation, ensures humanity is not constantly under siege. In the grand, cosmic accounting, the cycle might be seen as a balance. Darkness strong enough to periodically threaten the world, light strong enough to repeatedly defeat it. Neither side achieving complete victory. The struggle eternal, this cycle unbroken, the war continuing through centuries with no end in sight, unless something fundamental changes, unless someone finds a way to break the pattern entirely. That possibility would come, eventually. But not before more blood was spilled, more Belmonts tested, more centuries passed in the shadow of a castle that refused to stay buried. The Belmont name dominates the chronicles of vampire hunting, but they were never the only force standing between humanity and darkness. Other families, other traditions, other heroes rose to fight when circumstances demanded, or when the Belmont bloodline faltered. These parallel stories reveal the breadth of resistance against Dracula's eternal war. The Morris family represents the most significant alternative, bloodline. Descended from Quincy Morris, who himself traced lineage back to the Belmonts through distant branches, the Morris clan became vampire hunters in their own right during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Their story is particularly poignant because they wielded the vampire killer during a period when no pure Belmont could. After Richter's generation, the Belmont blood thinned. Whether through dilution across generations or some supernatural weakening is unclear, but by the early 1900s, No member of the direct Belmont line could safely wield the family whip without the weapon draining their life force. This created a crisis. The whip needed a wielder. Dracula's eventual return remained certain, but the family bloodline had failed its most basic requirement. Quincy Morris, a descendant through a branch so distant he did not even carry the Belmont name, stepped forward. The exact year of his most significant battle is recorded as 1897, though the details are fragmented. Based on what we can piece together, Quincy faced Dracula in a confrontation that mirrored events from Bram Stoker's novel. Though the fictional account and the Castlevania reality diverge in key ways, Quincy apparently defeated Dracula, but at tremendous cost. He did not survive the battle. The vampire killer passed to his son John Morris, who would wield it during one of history's darkest periods. World War I, 1917. Humanity was tearing itself apart on a scale never before seen. Millions dead in trenches, poison gas, mechanized slaughter. The unprecedented horror and bloodshed created the perfect environment for Dracula's return. The negative emotions, the despair, the sheer volume of death, all of it fed the resurrection. But the vampire lord did not manifest directly. Instead, his niece, the vampiress Elizabeth Bartley, orchestrated events. She manipulated the war itself, using the conflict's carnage to fuel resurrection rituals. Her goal was ambitious: use the global suffering to bring Dracula back at full power immediately, bypassing the usual vulnerable period after resurrection. John Morris, wielding his father's whip, tracked Bartley across a war-torn Europe. He was joined by Eric Lecard, a warrior whose family had been destroyed by vampires, wielding the Alucard spear, a weapon blessed to pierce darkness. Together, they fought through battlefields that blurred the line between human warfare and supernatural evil. Zombies shambled among the war dead. Vampires fed on soldiers dying in trenches. The castle manifestations appeared in ruined cities, taking advantage of destruction to camouflage their impossible architecture. The campaign across Europe culminated in a final battle against both Bartley and a weakened manifestation of Dracula himself. John and Eric succeeded, preventing the full resurrection, destroying Bartley, sending Dracula back to dormancy. But John Morris paid a price. The vampire killer, because his bloodline was so distant from the pure Belmont line, drained his life force with each use. He knew this, wielded it anyway, and died younger than he should have, vitality consumed by the weapon he had no choice but to carry. His son, Jonathan Morris, inherited the whip but struggled with it even more than his father had. By World War II, Jonathan could barely use the vampire killer without severe consequences. This created a unique dynamic where he fought alongside Charlotte Orlin, a powerful magic user who compensated for his inability to fully unleash the whip's power. During the early 1940s, as World War II raged, another attempt was made to resurrect Dracula using the war's unprecedented bloodshed. A vampire named Brona sought to use the conflict's suffering to bring back the Dark Lord. Jonathan and Charlotte infiltrated his operations, fighting through a twisted art gallery where paintings served as portals to nightmare realms. This period highlighted a crucial truth. The vampire killer alone, though powerful, was not always the deciding factor. Charlotte's magic, Jonathan's determination, their combined tactical thinking, these mattered as much as the sacred whip. Victory came not from overwhelming individual power like Richter possessed, but from cooperation, strategy, and unwillingness to surrender despite overwhelming odds. Other families and organizations emerged during Dracula's dormant periods. The Order of Ecclesia, founded in the early 1800s, developed their own methods of fighting darkness using glyphs, magical symbols that granted supernatural abilities. When the Belmont family vanished from public record around this time, possibly into hiding or simply declining as a bloodline, Ecclesia tried to fill the void. Shanoa, an Ecclesia member, fought Dracula in the early 1810s using the Dominus glyph, a powerful but dangerous magic that required her to sacrifice her emotions and memories. Her battle revealed that multiple paths existed to fight the same darkness. The Belmont way was not the only way. Different traditions, different magics, different approaches could all achieve the same goal if wielded by those with sufficient courage and sacrifice. Alucard himself deserves mention as a force beyond the Belmont tradition. Though Dracula's son, he repeatedly chose to stand against his father. He fought alongside Trevor in 1476. He defeated Dracula in 1797. And in later centuries he would appear again, using different names, different disguises, but always the same determination to honour his mother's final wish, that Dracula not hate humanity. Alucard's role complicated the simple narrative of Belmonts versus Dracula. Here was someone with vampire power choosing good over evil, family over duty, to his father's legacy. His existence proved that heritage does not determine destiny, that even beings born of darkness can choose light. The Belnades family, speakers and magic users descended from Cypher, maintained their own tradition of fighting supernatural evil. Though they often worked alongside Belmonts, they were not subordinate. Carrie Fernandez in the late 19th century, Yoko Belnades in the 21st, each represented their family's continuation of the magical arts used to battle darkness. These various families and traditions created a network of resistance spanning centuries. When one bloodline faltered, others stepped forward. When the Belmonts could not fight, the Morris family carried the burden. When traditional vampire hunting proved insufficient, organizations like Ecclesia developed new methods. The fight against Dracula became larger than any single family, any single weapon, any single approach. This diversity of response is perhaps humanity's greatest strength against eternal evil. Darkness may return in the same form century after century, but the light that opposes it comes from 1,000 different sources, each adapted to its time, each bringing unique strength to the eternal war. The Belmonts may have started the fight. They may be the most famous warriors in the Chronicle, but they were never alone. And that, more than any sacred whip or inherited duty, might be what has prevented Dracula from achieving final victory. He faces not just a family, but an idea, that darkness, no matter how powerful or persistent, will always find humans willing to stand against it. The year 1999, the edge of a new millennium. Humanity stood at a threshold, looking back on a century of unprecedented change and forward into an uncertain future. Technology had transformed society beyond recognition. Communication, travel, warfare, all had evolved in ways previous generations could not have imagined. But some things remained constant. Darkness, evil, and the inevitable return of Count Dracula. Julius Belmont represented a return to the direct bloodline, after generations where the family name had faded or the blood had thinned. Julius was born with the full power of his ancestors flowing through his veins. He could wield the vampire killer without the weapon draining his life. He possessed strength rivaling Richter's, and most importantly, he understood that the eternal war could not continue forever. Something had to break. Either Dracula would achieve final victory, or he would be stopped permanently. The cycle had to end. Dracula's resurrection in 1999 followed familiar patterns. The castle rose, darkness spread, monsters emerged from shadow. But the scale was different. This was not a localized threat to Transylvania or even Europe. The modern world's interconnected nature meant Dracula's influence could spread faster and farther than ever before. News of mysterious deaths reached global audiences within hours. Governments began investigating. The supernatural could no longer hide in isolated villages and remote castles. Julius responded to the threat with a coalition of allies. He was not alone, though historical records of his companions remain frustratingly incomplete. What we know suggests he worked with representatives of various vampire hunting traditions, combining the Belmont legacy with other approaches, other magics, other strengths. The battle has come to be known as the Demon Castle War, though few details survived. What happened within Castlevania's walls during those final days is largely lost to history. Julius himself would later suffer amnesia, the trauma of the conflict erasing his memories. Piecing together the truth requires assembling fragments from multiple sources, each incomplete, each possibly inaccurate. What seems certain is that Julius did not simply defeat Dracula. He went further. With the help of others, possibly including Japanese Shinto priests who contributed their own spiritual traditions to the battle, Julius managed something no previous Belmont had achieved: a true sealing. Dracula was destroyed, yes, his physical form obliterated. But more than that, his very essence was bound, trapped within a seal connected to a solar eclipse. The castle itself was drawn into this seal, removed from the physical world entirely. As long as the eclipse held, as long as the spiritual barriers remained intact, Dracula could not resurrect. The 100-year cycle was broken. The cost of this victory remains unknown. What Julius sacrificed, what his allies gave up, what dark bargains or terrible prices were paid to achieve what centuries of Belmonts could not, all of it is lost to his amnesia and the secrecy surrounding the event. Julius emerged from the Demon Castle War victorious, but broken. His memories were gone. He knew he was a Belmont. He knew he had fought Dracula. But the specifics, the how and why, the faces of his companions, even his own techniques and training, all of it had been stripped away. He rebuilt his life as best he could, settled into something approaching normalcy. 36 years would pass before darkness called to him again. 2035, a solar eclipse. The same celestial event that had sealed Dracula's castle began to weaken. Whether this was inevitable, whether the seal was always temporary, or whether something specific triggered the deterioration remains unclear. But as the eclipse reached its peak, Castlevania began manifesting again, bleeding through from whatever dimension held it captive. A young man named Soma Cruz, an ordinary high school student with no knowledge of vampire hunting or supernatural warfare, was drawn into the castle during the eclipse. This should not have been possible. The ceiling should have prevented anyone from entering. But Soma was not ordinary in ways he did not understand. He was Dracula's reincarnation, not a resurrection, not a copy. The actual soul of Dracula, reborn into a human life with no memory of its previous existence, no awareness of what it had been. This was unprecedented. The Vampire Lord's defeat in 1999 had been so complete that his essence had been forced into the cycle of reincarnation, starting over as immortal with free will. Julius, his memories partially restored by the castle's return, recognized what Soma was, recognized the danger. If Soma accepted his nature, if he embraced the power dormant within him, Dracula would return through the body of this innocent young man. The cycle would begin again, all the sacrifice of 1999 rendered meaningless. But Julius also recognized something else. Soma had choice. Unlike every other Dracula manifestation, unlike the resurrection through rituals and dark magic, this version had genuine free will. He could reject what he was, could choose to remain human, could break the curse not through sealing or destruction, but through conscious decision. Julius walked a razor's edge throughout the events of 2035. He helped Soma navigate Castlevania's dangers, taught him to fight, provided information. But he also made clear that if Soma chose darkness, if the young man decided to become the Dark Lord, Julius would kill him. No hesitation, no mercy. The threat was not empty. Julius carried the vampire killer. He had defeated Dracula before. He would do it again if necessary. Soma was not the only one drawn into the castle. Others with connections to Dracula's power, with ambitions to claim the Dark Lord's throne for themselves, manipulated events to try to force Soma into accepting his nature. Celia Fortner and her cult believed that if Dracula's reincarnation rejected his power, someone else would need to become the Dark Lord. They sought to create a new Dracula to ensure the cycle continued. Their manipulation tested Soma in ways physical combat could not. They murdered his friend Mina's parents right in front of him, trying to trigger rage and darkness. They put him in impossible situations, forced him to choose between his human morality and the power that would let him save those he loved. Soma resisted. Again and again, faced with opportunities to embrace his dark nature, he chose humanity, chose to remain himself rather than become what he had been. This was a victory different from any battlefield triumph. This was defeating Dracula from within, using the vampire lord's own reincarnated soul against his legacy. Julius watched this struggle, ready to intervene if necessary. In some timelines, some possibilities, he did have to fight Soma. If the young man failed his trials, if darkness won, Julius would face him in the castle's depths and destroy both Soma and the Dracula within him. These bad endings exist as shadows, as warnings, as reminders that victory was never certain. But in the true timeline, Soma prevailed. He rejected Dracula's power completely. The castle, having no true Dark Lord to sustain it, sealed itself again. The threat passed, and for the first time in nearly 1,000 years Dracula's defeat felt permanent. Not because he had been destroyed more thoroughly than before, not because the sealing was stronger, but because the soul that had been Mathias Cronqvist, that had become Dracula, had chosen a different path, had rejected its own darkness, had proven that even the most evil consciousness could change if given the chance. Julius's mission was complete. He had ensured that if Dracula returned, it would not be through his original soul. That soul had moved on, chosen differently, broken the cycle through will rather than force. The vampire killer was placed into storage. The Belmont duty, after nearly a millennium, was fulfilled. Julius could rest, knowing that he had succeeded not just in defeating darkness, but in ending it. Or so he hoped. Darkness has a way of finding new forms, new sources, new paths into the world. But for now, in 2035, with Dracula's soul choosing light and Castlevania sealed once more, there was peace. The eternal war had ended, not with a final battle, but with a choice. Not with violence, but with mercy. Not with a Belmont destroying Dracula, but with Dracula destroying himself, choosing to not be what he had been for so long. It was the ending Leon never could have imagined when he made his vow in 1094, but perhaps it was the only ending that could truly work. Darkness cannot be destroyed from without. It must be rejected from within. And in Soma Cruz, Dracula's own soul finally found the strength to say no. From 1094 to 2035, 941 years, multiple generations, countless battles. The Belmont family and their allies fought the same war across nearly a millennium, facing an enemy who returned again and again, learning from each defeat, adapting, evolving, but never truly changing. This is the weight of the Castlevania legacy. Not just the individual stories of brave warriors facing supernatural evil, but the accumulated burden of centuries, the psychological toll of knowing your struggle will never truly end in your lifetime, that your victory is always temporary, that your children or their children will have to fight the same battles you fought. The Belmonts could not escape their duty. It was written into their blood by Leon's vow, reinforced by Sara's sacrifice, passed down through training and tradition until it became inseparable from identity itself. To be a Belmont meant to be a vampire hunter. There was no other option, no alternative career, no escape clause. This created family dynamics unlike any other. Belmont parents had to train their children to fight and kill from young ages. They had to teach combat skills before teaching social graces. They had to prepare their children for trauma and death and suffering in ways that would seem abusive in any other context. But the alternative was worse. An unprepared Belmont facing Dracula would die, and their death would doom countless innocents. Better to steal childhood through harsh training than to fail in duty through gentle neglect. The psychological cost ripples through the generations. Simon suffered for 7 years under Dracula's curse. Christopher watched his son be corrupted and transformed. Richter, the strongest Belmont, fell to pride and manipulation. Each victory came with scars. Each survival meant carrying new trauma, and yet they persisted. Generation after generation, they picked up the whip and walked into darkness. Not because they wanted to, not because they were heroes in the traditional sense, but because it was their duty, and duty mattered more than comfort, safety, or personal desire. The castle itself stands as a monument to this eternal struggle, a creature of chaos that rebuilds itself with each resurrection. Castlevania represents more than just Dracula's power. It symbolizes the persistence of evil, the way darkness adapts and changes while remaining fundamentally the same. The corridors shift, the monsters evolve, the architecture defies natural law, but the core remains constant. The throne room always sits at the highest point. Dracula always waits there. The confrontation always happens in that same space, across centuries, as if time itself collapses in that final chamber. This repetition with variation mirrors the Belmont legacy itself. Different warriors, different techniques, different circumstances, but always the same duty, always the same enemy, always the same whip cracking against the same darkness. The vampire killer, blessed by Sara's loving sacrifice, serves as the physical link connecting all these stories. Leon wielded it first. Trevor carried it into the first true battle. Simon used it to lift his curse. Richter pushed it to its limits. Julius employed it in the final sealing. The weapon itself is a character in this saga, a constant presence through centuries of change. Imagine holding that whip in your hands and knowing that your great-great-great-grandfather held it before you and his ancestor before him, stretching back through time. Every crack of the leather echoes countless previous battles. Every victory adds to its legend. Every drop of vampire blood spilled strengthens its blessing. But also imagine the pressure, the weight of expectation, the knowledge that if you fail, if you prove unworthy, the weapon itself will reject you, drain your life, leave you powerless before the darkness you swore to fight. The whip demands worthiness, not just strength, but moral character, not just skill, but determination. It tests each new wielder, forcing them to prove themselves deserving of Sara's sacrifice, worthy of Leon's legacy, capable of continuing the eternal war. This standard means that many Belmonts never held the whip, despite being born to the bloodline. They lack the physical strength, or the spiritual purity, or simply the particular combination of qualities the vampire killer demanded. These family members lived in the shadow of the legend, knowing they were Belmonts but unable to fulfill the family's primary purpose. The tragedy of this extends beyond individual disappointment. A generation without a worthy Belmont meant the duty fell to others, the Morris family, the Order of Ecclesia, whoever could step forward. And while these alternative hunters were brave and capable, they lacked the specific advantage that Belmont blood and the vampire killer together provided. Yet perhaps this is fitting. The fight against Dracula was never meant to rest on a single family, a single weapon, a single approach. The fact that others could and did step forward when the Belmonts failed or faltered proves that humanity itself is the true opposition to darkness, not just one bloodline's curse. Alucard understood this. He was not human, not Belmont, not even truly alive in the conventional sense. Yet he fought alongside Trevor, defeated Dracula when Richter could not, and helped Soma resist the darkness within himself. His commitment came not from duty or blood curse, but from choice, from honouring his mother's memory and final wish. This multiplicity of resistance, this diversity of approaches and motivations might be why Dracula ultimately failed. He was singular, focused, unchanging in his essential nature despite cosmetic adaptations. Humanity, by contrast, was plural, diverse, unpredictable. When one approach failed, another emerged. When one family faltered, another stood up. When physical strength proved insufficient, magic or cunning or sacrifice filled the gap. The Castlevania saga is often framed as Belmonts versus Dracula, but it is more accurately humanity versus darkness. The Belmonts were the spear point, the most visible and consistent force, but they were never alone. They were supported, aided, sometimes replaced by others who shared their commitment if not their blood. And in the end, Dracula was defeated not by superior force but by his own soul choosing differently. Soma Cruz, the reincarnation, used free will to break what violence could not. The cycle ended not because Julius was stronger than previous Belmonts, but because darkness itself, given the choice, opted for light. This is the true legacy of Castlevania. Not that good always triumphs over evil, because the countless resurrections prove otherwise. Not that virtue is rewarded, because the Belmonts paid terrible prices for their victories. But that persistence matters. That duty, honoured across generations, eventually creates opportunities for change. That even the most eternal evil can be ended if humanity refuses to surrender, refuses to accept darkness as inevitable, refuses to let the cycle continue unchallenged. Leon Belmont made a vow in 1094. He could not have known it would take nearly 1,000 years to fulfill, could not have imagined the suffering his descendants would endure, could not have foreseen that the final victory would come through mercy rather than violence. But he made the vow anyway, started the fight anyway, passed the whip to his descendants anyway. And that choice, made in grief and rage and determination, echoed across centuries until it found its answer in a young man who chose not to be a monster. The eternal war is over. The castle sleeps, the whip rests, and in the silence that follows, we can finally hear what the story's been telling us all along. That darkness is persistent, but light is patient, that evil returns, but so does resistance, that some battles span lifetimes, but every war eventually ends, even the eternal ones.